And finally, in 2001, Jim McCluskey went down to Cofield Prison, maximum security prison in Texas, and met with Ben. And he had reviewed the whole case. He had looked through all the trial transcripts, everything. And he had become convinced that Ben was probably innocent.
And let me just ask you, Barb, you said that Ben rejected a plea offer that would have involved him pleading guilty to a robbery he didn't commit and doing maybe another 2 or 3 years. And that year that he was offered that plea,
that was in 1988.
So he could have been out potentially by 1990. You just said, I'm just setting out the timeline, that he wrote to Centurion Ministries in 1989. And it wasn't until 2001 that Centurion Ministries took him up on his request. The fact that Ben had the principles not to take advantage of a plea offer that would have put him back out on the street and back home after a couple of years, and instead he held fast to his convictions, it's staggering.
It is.
And it's admirable, which is an understatement. So going back now to 2001, when Centurion Ministries gets involved.
Then I should say that the 1990s were a really interesting decade in the sense that, kind of like Charles Dickens, it was the best times and the worst of times. The worst of times because we had the 3 strikes and you're out law. We had EDPA, the 1996 law. We had Bill Clinton making it really increasing the penalties, and Congress, passing very, very draconian crime bills in 94 and 96. You had the Supreme Court beginning to interpret very narrowly, close the avenues for getting out, getting your case heard on appeal. So you had all these you had super predators. Do you remember that?
Oh, I sure do.
Right. So this was a dark decade, but it was also a really exciting decade because you had the discovery of DNA evidence, the technology. And suddenly with the Innocence Project, all you had to do is sit there in your living room and watch the news every night, and you'd see one person after another walking out of the jailhouse, out of the courthouse and into the sunlight because they'd been exonerated by DNA.
And when you say the best of times and the worst of times, so I started prosecuting in the 80s, obviously through the 90s when we had real challenges in Washington, D.C. too. But when I hear that statement, it kind of lands with me like, well, maybe the best of times if Ross Perot takes an interest in your case, but the worst of times for somebody like Ben Spencer.
Right.
So, but DNA was certainly a great tool, though it didn't really begin producing the results it could have until many years later.
Right. And it didn't in Ben's case because there wasn't DNA in his case. And so he was stuck. So, and during this decade, he lost his wife. He insisted she divorce him, move on with her life. She did, but remained his most loyal friend. His friends got either exonerated or paroled. I mean, it was a dark time. But then in 2001, Jim McCluskey shows up at Cofield Prison, and they talk for a while. And Jim says, "Do you know I'm here?" And Ben said, "Well, you want to talk about the case?" And "Yeah, but do you know I'm here?" "Well, you're interested in the case, Ben. We are going to represent you. We're going to reinvestigate this, and we are not going to stop until you get out of prison." And so that gave him this great hope. And Jim McCluskey, I mean, he didn't have any background to let him do this. He was a seminarian in Princeton. When he decided one of the inmates that he would kind of minister to was innocent, he got him out. He reinvestigated the case, got him out while he was in seminary. And when he graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary, he realized that his call wasn't to the pulpit, it was to the wrongly convicted. And that's why he started Centurion Ministries. So this guy is this New Jersey guy who just kind of goes into the scariest parts of anywhere, Trenton, New Jersey, or Dallas, or wherever, and gets evidence, puts on this little minister's collar, and people confess to him. And so here he is. He just does boots on the ground, and he begins investigating and talking to witnesses, and it amasses enough evidence that both forensic evidence and witness evidence to get all of this before a Dallas judge. and asked for an evidentiary hearing, and which is a hearing, of course, where a judge will reconsider new evidence. Correct me if I'm wrong in this description, but will reconsider new evidence and decide whether a person got a fair trial. Is that
You
correct?
can file a motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. I will say there are a lot of procedural hurdles and time limits that are often placed on motions for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. But a lot of jurisdictions also have a bit of an escape hatch for people. So yeah, I don't know exactly how it works in the Dallas criminal justice system.
But he was, I mean, just a very brief story about him. He was a newly elected judge in 2006. He was elected. And one of the first things he finds is this banker's box with all of these files. And Ben's lawyer and Jim McCluskey go and talk to him, saying, this is a case we want you to look at. And so he literally shuts down his courtroom for a week to read through everything. He goes down to the crime scene, the alleyway. He actually takes this seriously. And he holds an evidentiary hearing in 2007 where he essentially relitigates the case. He really eviscerates the jailhouse snitch. He questions one of the eyewitnesses had died in a drug deal, but he questions the other two, really he grills them. He also listens to an expert who says, forensic expert who says, studies kind of what people can see under what lighting condition. And the expert said, look, you couldn't identify your own brother unless you were within 25 feet. And the witnesses were far, far away. So he listens to all of this evidence, and he listens to one other thing, which I hadn't brought up. What we've got in this case is our incentivized witnesses. We've got a jailhouse informant. We've got tunnel vision because the police believed it was Ben. But one part of tunnel vision that existed in this case that we didn't discover till much later was that two people had gone to the police before the trial and said, you have the wrong guy. There's this other guy, Michael Hubbard. He's a friend of ours. He's hyped up on crack cocaine all the time. He's violent. He described the entire assault, driving back in the BMW, seeing Jeffrey Young, the victim, fall out of the trunk, parking, running away. He described all of this. They went to the police. Two men didn't even know the other was doing it. And the police ignored it. They ignored that evidence. And so here's tunnel vision where police are so fixated on one suspect that they basically make their theory fit the facts rather than the facts fit the theory.
This is where my blood pressure rises as a former career prosecutor. Tunnel vision is a nice word for ignoring Brady information, exculpatory information that would be helpful to the defense. Ignoring it, burying it, not doing your constitutional duty and turning it over to the defense attorney for Ben is something I wouldn't call tunnel vision. Feels like abject corruption.
Yeah. Yes.
That's just me.
A lot of people would agree with you. So what happened during this evidentiary hearing is they brought in Michael Hubbard, the man who had been accused, who then was later prosecuted for doing the exact same thing to 10 other men. None of the other men died, but the exact same MO. He was called the Batman, hitting people with over the head with a blunt instrument. They brought in Michael Hubbard into the evidentiary hearing, and Michael Hubbard claimed the fifth. So the judge takes all this information, considers it, comes out with an opinion, a finding that Ben Spencer should be released because he's actually innocent.
And this was what year?
This was 2008.
So this should be the happy ending, albeit delayed quite a bit.
Right. But it's not a Hollywood ending. Not yet. Not for a long time. Because in Texas, there aren't many states. Oklahoma is another one. The judge can't actually release someone he believes is innocent. The findings have to go up to the Court of Criminal Appeals, which is the high court in Texas. And the court has to agree that he is innocent. In this court, all Republicans, most former prosecutors, all elected officials, as most local and state, judges are. They go, no, you know what? There's no DNA in this case. I'm sorry, Ben. You're going to spend the rest of your life in prison.
Mm.
That was 2011. And so it looked like it was over for Ben. Everyone was despairing. Even Ben was a bit despairing. He tried to climb back out of it because you can't live that way. But there he was, in prison for life in 2011. And, kind of what happened was what?
And you got involved
Right.
yourself in 2017?
Right.
How did you come to be involved?
So Jim had told me about this case in 2016, and I was working on other stories, so I didn't actually begin the research till 2017. And I went down and think of this. What a fool's errand. It's 2017 is 30 years after the crime.
How do you find evidence 30 years after a crime?
That's right. And so the story I sold to the Atlantic was, and to NPR was, how do you get out of prison if you've been declared innocent, but there's no DNA? That was basically the story. And I was going to go down, and I hoped I'd find a new evidence, but I was not optimistic. So I joined forces with a private investigator named Daryl Parker, who was doing this for free, and because he believed Ben was innocent. And Daryl and I we went around to the sketchiest areas of Dallas, looking for witnesses, new witnesses, old witnesses, trying to track down Gladys Oliver and, Danny Edwards and Jimmy Cotton, who was the other teenager who was still alive. Just went all over the place for a few weeks. And guess what? We found new evidence.
And I know you have one really colorful story about you and Daryl Parker.
Yes.
And I had the pleasure and privilege of meeting Daryl at a recent event and meeting Ben and meeting Deborah, his wife. And we'll talk maybe about that a little bit at the end. But can you share with us that story about you and Daryl Parker out there just, kind of being the police, kind of going and trying to find evidence and witnesses 30 years later?
Right. Yeah. So there were actually a couple of stories, but one, I think the one you're thinking about is we went to see Jimmy Cotton, and Jimmy Cotton was one of the eyewitnesses who said he saw Ben running away from the car. So it's a rainy day. We've gone all sorts of places to find Jimmy Cotton, and we can't find him. And finally, we find that maybe he's at his mother's apartment. So we go to this apartment. It's pouring rain. The rain is kind of like a Motel 6, like there's a kind of balcony and the rain's pouring out behind us. And we're standing in front of his door. And Daryl's about to knock. And he looks over at me. And Daryl's actually to the left of the door. I'm standing right in front of the door. And Daryl looks at me and he takes me gently by the shoulders and quietly moves me to the side. And he whispers, "Sometimes they shoot through the door."
Good to know.
Thank you.
Good to know. Probably not a skill you learned at NPR as a reporter.
No, it wasn't doing Washington, right? Senator, are you going to shoot through the door? Right. And so we knock on the door and the woman says, "Who is it?" "Ma'am, it's Daryl Parker," as if that explains anything, right? "And what do you want?" "We want to talk about a case." "Whose case?" "Ben Spencer's case." "We want to talk to Jimmy Cotton." And the next thing we know, we hear a little rustling, and there is Jimmy Cotton. 30 years later, he's now in his late 40s. We sit down, and I have to say that as a journalist, I'd really mapped out this interview because we're recording it. It's, for the NPR and the Atlantic, and I don't want to spook him. And so I want to begin slowly. And I just asked him to tell me a little bit about himself. And then he blurts out, "I'm not saying it was Ben." I know. I mean, it was dark. Could have been Ben. Maybe it wasn't. So, the whole story just unspools after this, where he begins to say, it was dark out. I couldn't really see very well. He was tall. I thought maybe it was Ben. The police mentioned Ben. Gladys mentioned Ben. And, kind of it becomes this confessional. So we have this all on tape.
And let's be clear, again, as a former career prosecutor, when we get recantations, we need to test them because we want to support our convictions if we can do so honestly and ethically and in accordance with the evidence. And I have experienced false recantations under all sorts of and I've experienced legitimate recantations. So this is not an all or nothing proposition ever.
Right. And he ends up going to the prosecutor's office, and this was in 2017, going to the prosecutor's office, doing an affidavit, doing a polygraph with the polygrapher that was typically used by the state, and he passes with flying colors. No, you're right. That isn't dispositive evidence. We also I'll just tell you one other story that I really love. Are we allowed to swear?
Oh, of course.
Okay.
I'm from Jersey. Come on.
So we try to find Danny Edwards, the jailhouse informant. And we finally, the last place we go to, we don't find him. And then finally we come to this place, this house. It's a pink house with about 8 families that live there. It's kind of a halfway house for people who've just gotten out of prison. And we go there and we knock on the door. And after a while, people say they don't know Danny Edwards. And so we're kind of leaving and we're sitting in the Jeep. Daryl and I are sitting in the Jeep and we see this woman waving at us. This actually is an important thing that I learned as a journalist. We see this woman waving at us from across the street. And we go over there and she says, "Are you looking for Danny Edwards?" And we say, "Yes." And she goes, "Well, I'm his fiance. Do you want his cell phone number?" And so we call him and we make an appointment. He's a Rico man, so he can't talk to us that night. But we make an appointment to see him the next day. And one of the lessons that I learned as a journalist that I can't believe I didn't know this before. Well, there are 2 lessons. One is just show up. Don't just call or text or email. Actually, just show up. Go there. That's one thing, because you never know what you'll find, right? The other is that time is both the enemy and the friend of truth. And by that, over time, witnesses die or memories go bad or, stuff happens. Evidence is lost. But also in time, allegiances change, right? People's conscience eats away at them. They no longer have a reason to lie. Like Danny Edwards, the statute of limitations had expired. So he didn't have any reason to lie to us. Right.
Barb, you're singing my tune because back when I was chief of homicide at the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, I said, listen, we need to create a cold case review project because when cases are sitting in a police department storage room or file cabinet gathering dust, you could pick up literally any homicide investigative jacket and look at it from 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And what I can promise you is the circumstances of every single witness have changed. Some for the better, some for the worse. And we actually made some progress on that front, looking at old jackets, re-interviewing witnesses. And the truth began to emerge because maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago, they had no interest in talking to them.
That's
police, right. Or, maybe, they used to be law-abiding folk. Now they're jammed up and they need some help from us. I mean, motivations change. People's life circumstances change. So that's why, frankly, when we have 300,000 unsolved murder cases in the United States right now, every one of them should be given a relook. And we've passed some legislation, federal legislation, the Homicide Victims Families Rights Act, that has given families who've lost a loved one to violent crime a legal right, the statutory right to that relook. Anyway, I'm getting off track, but
no, that's great. Wow, that's great. Yeah, so Danny Edwards, when we started talking to him, he had no reason to lie anymore. And so he said, so Danny, did Ben actually, confess to you? No. He didn't confess.
This is the Jailhouse snitch.
Yeah. He said they accused of him of it, but no, he didn't do it. And I said, well, what gives? He goes, look, this is the way the game is played in jail. I lie on you, you lie on me, the best liar wins. said, the police just told me. They told me kind of what happened, and I just made a really good story. I can make any story better. And he said, yeah, no. Didn't say it in my heart of heart. He didn't do it. And he said, by the way, how is Ben anyway? And I said, well, Danny, he's in prison. He's in prison for life. And Daryl said, so how does that make you feel? Like, shit. He said, I'll come in. I'll do an affidavit. So
you are collecting up what I would call blockbuster evidence of actual innocence.
Mhm.
Of course, a few minutes ago, you told us a judge had already declared him actually innocent, but the appellate court quibbled with that conclusion. Right. So where do you go with all of this dramatic evidence of innocence?
And we also found a new alibi witness, so who was with Ben at the time of the assault. So with all of this, I mean, here's the problem. Here's the problem as a journalist. The story was published in The Atlantic, came out on NPR, and nothing happened. Mm. And that's because the DA was unwilling to reopen the investigation. And so what I often realize is what I think is that some of these cases, a lot of these cases, when people get out, it's just serendipity. It's like circumstances change and suddenly you get a window through which you can escape. So what happened is nothing happened. And then in 2018, so my articles came out in January of 2018, a new DA was elected, John Creusot. Black man, had been a judge, had been a prosecutor. Actually, when Ben was he didn't know of Ben's case, but when Ben was convicted, had been a prosecutor in the Dallas office. And Ben's lawyers and a new lawyer who came onto the case went to him. I called him up the day after he was elected. I'm going to give you a little secret. I was so excited. He was not yet DA, but he was a judge. But he called me back on his cell phone, and all I could think is, yes, I have your cell phone. So he called, and I talked to him, and I said, would you just take a look at this story? And he goes, well, I know about this case. It's been up and down. I don't think there's anything I could do. And I said, okay, but let me just send you the article. And so long story short, he decides that there's enough evidence to reopen the case. And he gives it to something that is, it's like a watershed idea that the Dallas DA's office came up with in 2007. So, a long time before, 10 years before. And it's this idea of a conviction integrity unit.
The CIU.
The
Institute of One at the DC Attorney's Office. I am familiar with the concept of the CIU. Make sure we got it right, because you know what? If we're not afraid to defend the results that we achieved, let's give it another look. Right. Let's make sure we got it right.
And what the prosecutor had, in this case, he assigned the head of the CIU, a woman named Cynthia Garza, to look at the case. She had access to files in the police and prosecutors' offices that defense attorneys didn't have and reporters didn't have. So she took our evidence, which was relatively new evidence, and drilled down. And she found even more evidence that the witnesses were lying. In fact, she found evidence that Gladys Oliver had told the prosecutors 10 years earlier, or not 8 years earlier, she had told the prosecutors that she'd received $5,000 to $10,000 from Ross Perot. This was before the Court of Criminal Appeals rejected the finding. So, this was usable information. She had lied. They found confirming evidence that Danny Edwards had lied, that he had gotten a deal for his case. He was facing 25 years in prison. He walked out 2 months after he testified in the second trial. Right? They found all this evidence. They found someone else who knew about Gladys and the money she'd received. I mean, she found I think of her. I'm not sure if she likes this, but the soundtrack from Jaws. That's how I think of Cynthia Garza when she is on a case. That you better watch out if you've been hiding evidence, because she found all this evidence. And in 2021, they decided that Ben had not gotten a fair trial. Well, they made a strategic decision because the innocence bar, finding that he was innocent, that was high. It's called a Herculean burden in Texas. You have to find kind of completely new evidence, like a videotape that no one had uncovered, or DNA evidence that showed definitively that he was innocent. And they didn't, but what they did is they said he didn't get a fair trial. And that's a lower standard. So they asked that he be released, and he walked out of prison 34 years after, almost to the day, after he was arrested on March 12th, 2021, to hordes of people. I mean, you should see the tape. There's a documentary that we're working on. I mean, if I can just describe the scene.
Please.
So there's a hearing with a new judge in the 283rd District, the same courtroom that Ben had been tried and convicted twice, same courtroom, new judge. She hears the evidence from the prosecutors that Ben didn't get a fair trial and rules immediately that he did, that he should be released based on this. And it's a Friday afternoon. There have been, people knew about this. So there were a couple hundred people waiting at the jail, at the courthouse and jail. They're right there, adjacent to each other. And so all of these people are waiting outside. It's bitterly cold. It was during that time when they had that terrible vortex, that snowstorm.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are waiting outside. For some reason, the guards allowed everyone to come into the lobby of the jail. So, man. And they're waiting, they're singing, they're laughing, everything else. And Ben and his ex-wife, Deborah, who's been his best friend through all this, come out from behind where the jail was and come out, stop at the edge of the lobby and look around at these 200 people who are just, screaming in excitement and singing. And he looks really happy. She looks kind of dumbfounded, like, oh my gosh. And they thread their way through the crowd. The waters part. They go outside, and he meets up with the district attorney, John Creuzot, and they give a brief press conference, and then Ben is gone. This isn't the Hollywood ending.
This is not the Hollywood.
No.
Not yet. I know. It even gets better than that scene you just described, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you've mentioned a couple of times that Ben insisted that Deborah, his wife, divorce him.
Yes.
Can you just, but you just said Ben and his ex-wife. And I know that's also not necessarily the end of the story, but why was it that Ben kept insisting that his wife, Deborah, divorce him?
He knew that she was so struggling. Here she had this infant, this young boy. He was growing up, and he just knew that she was crying all the way home. It was a 2-hour drive from the prison to Dallas. That she was miserable because of I mean, not because it wasn't his fault, but she was really, really struggling, and he felt that wasn't any life to live. And he loved her, and he said, you need to move on with your life. And she fought him for a couple of years, and finally she divorced him, and she remarried someone else for 5 minutes, and realized she was still in love with Ben. And I was able to chronicle their relationship and also a bit of prison. Most of the letters that he wrote to her, all of her letters were burned in a fire in her mother's garage. But most of his letters in the 90s were lost. But I have letters, about 2,500 pages of letters, handwritten letters from Ben to Deborah from 2000 until he left. And what you see is he's crazy in love with her. They had talked about getting married when he was still in prison. He didn't want that kind of wedding. At one point in 2005, he was going to be coming up for parole in 2007. And he wrote her and he said, babe, I really hate to kill your joy. I don't want to kill your joy, but I've got to tell you, I'm probably not going to get parole. And the reason I'm not going to get parole is because to get parole, you have to express remorse for the crime. And I can't express remorse for a crime I didn't commit. And the words he ended this passage with are, he said, truth is more important to me than my freedom.
Mm.
And he did not get parole at all, ever. That was 2005. He walked out 16 years later.